tool. So with this software model that's supposed to help city decision makers with long-term strategic planning around sustainability. And the reason that we approached Minneapolis is because we knew two things. One, that Minneapolis was really a leading city in sustainability in the US. And second, that Minneapolis was a city that wasn't afraid to look at the results and be honest about them. So wasn't afraid to be able to do some of these modeling projects, to work with the private sector, and to be able to say, okay, well, maybe even if we throw all of these technologies at Minneapolis, then we're still not going to reach this 80 by 50 target. So the good news is that even after doing this project, even after looking at the results of the city performance tool, what we found is that it is possible for Minneapolis to achieve this 80 by 50 target. Now, I mentioned that we've been working with more than 20 cities across the world, and we haven't yet had a result like this one. So we've had results where people haven't been able to, or cities haven't been able to achieve this 80 by 50 target. We've worked with cities like Copenhagen, with Helsinki, about shorter term targets that they now have publicly acknowledged that they're not going to meet. But this was the first time in the first analysis that we really saw 80 by 50 is achievable. But it's achievable only with a lot of effort. So the number one recommendation out of this was to continue cleaning the electricity mix. And fortunately, we had the support of the Clean Energy Partnership, the support of Xcel Energy and Centerpoint when we were doing this analysis. So that was one of the first recommendations. The second was looking around electric transport. So once you have this cleaner electricity mix, then how do you start moving a transportation system so it's more about electrification of transportation? And then the third was around having the city be a leader in terms of energy efficiency in buildings. And you'll see specifically some of the building technologies that we had recommended, but then also just this idea of the city being a leader around actually implementing some of the technologies. So just to give you some context, this analysis came just at the point as the Clean Energy Partnership was announced, just at the point as, and actually we were midway through the project when Xcel announced that they were going to be revising their clean energy proposal and moving it up towards this 65% clean energy mix. So this was a really great moment to be working with the City of Minneapolis' Sustainability Office to look at technology pathways to 80 by 50. So we showed, not only that continuing on this clean electricity mix was the way to go in terms of reaching 80 by 50, but also that additional measures would be needed in order to reach this 80 by 50 target. So there would need to be the uptake and implementation of 40 building and transport technologies on top of that cleaning of the electricity mix. And as I mentioned before, electrification of transport was one of the major things we looked at, as well as improving energy efficiency in buildings. So just to give you a little bit of background information about the city performance tool itself. This is a software model that Siemens has been developing over a number of years. And the reason we developed it is because we saw cities deciding to take sustainability into their own hands and setting some very ambitious sustainability targets. So we were trying to figure out what is Siemens' role in supporting urban sustainability. I mean, it's really great that actually as a company we've pledged to be carbon neutral, but what can we do to help cities figure out how they get to these ambitious sustainability targets? The way that we knew how to do that best was through technology. So through looking at energy and buildings and transportation, and understanding whether or not there were technologies that could be customized to a city context in order to then help with energy efficiency, help with reducing emissions from electricity, help with getting people maybe off the road and into public transportation. So we also wanted to make sure that we were looking at indicators that matter to cities. So one of the main things that we are talking about in this particular study is CO2 equivalent emissions. And that was because we were looking at this 80 by 50 target. But certainly any of the technologies that have carbon emissions implications have air quality implications as well. And they also have jobs and they have cost implications. So we definitely looked through the lens of the sustainability, holistic sustainability, and looking at green both from an environmental perspective and from an economic perspective. we're supporting more than 20 cities worldwide. So again, this number is going to grow to probably close to 40 and maybe even more next year. But this, one of the benefits of doing this analysis and being able to work with Minneapolis so closely on this is that we were then able to pick and choose best practices from across the world in terms of what people are learning from the CYPT results and then how they're moving it forward. And as I go through some of the results, I'll also kind of reference what's happening in Asia, where we're working with cities like Seoul, Nanjing, Wuhan, what we're doing in Europe, where we're working with London, Helsinki, Copenhagen, and then what we're doing in North America, where we're just finishing up a project with San Francisco and have been working with Boston and Portland and DC as well. So in terms of why Minneapolis decided to use the CYPT, we covered this before, but really this came at a good moment in terms of the Clean Energy Partnership, in terms of getting ready for maybe a new round of climate action planning. And so Gail was very much trying to use, Gail and Brendan and Kelly, I should say, were very much trying to use the CYPT as a, an informational, educational tool around how technology could impact the city of Minneapolis. We took a snapshot of some of the stats from Minneapolis today. And I won't go through the exact data on this slide, other than to say that when we looked across CYPT cities, two of the things that stood out the most is that really in all US cities, electricity consumption per capita was much higher than in other places, and then the average household size, so the square footage for an average household, was much larger. So when we were looking towards the results, we were really thinking about land use, density, and all the other considerations that go into then creating a kind of holistic plan around policy and technology implementation. The final thing is that this public transit mode share. So as we're looking through these slides, the mode share that we're referencing is not journeys, it's passenger miles traveled. So it's a little bit different number than probably what you've seen around mode share. But what we're seeing in cities like Minneapolis or other US cities is that, of course, the public transit mode share is much lower than when you're looking at Europe or when you're looking at Asia. So when it comes to that, actually, the electric cars, the electric vehicles have had much higher results than they've had in other parts of the world, simply by virtue of the fact that we're more reliant on car transport.
So in that mode share, what's the rest of it then? If 6% is public transit, how much do you break down the other 94% into what main categories? 92%
of that is car transport. And then the remainder is split among cycling, walking, and then other types of transportation.
Okay.
So in terms of the analysis, we start by creating a baseline, an emissions baseline. And the reason I'm showing you this slide is twofold. One is that we tried to be as accurate as possible to Minneapolis's published greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And we actually got pretty darn close. So rounded up, 4.5 million metric tons is what we found under the CYPT, and that's the same rounded up as from the community-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We also found that a little more than half of the emissions were from buildings. So again, when we were looking at the different technologies, we focused a fair bit on buildings in terms of trying to pick out what might have the most impact in reducing emissions. Transportation was a little under half. Then when we broke down the emissions by the various categories, we found again that residential buildings, passenger transport, especially car transport, and then road freight transport were the main three culprits in terms of producing emissions in Minneapolis. And this is the city of Minneapolis. So we kept our boundary pretty tight in terms of looking at just what was happening within Minneapolis itself.
What does infrastructure in terms of transport? You don't think of infrastructure as burning fossil fuels?
That would be the street lights and the traffic lights, so the electricity that's powering those lights.
Councilmember Bender has a question too.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to forget this question, so it may be later and or maybe something to follow up about, but I'm curious about the idea of using passenger miles as the mode share, and I think that makes sense, but I'm also interested in how long, we have a very sprawling region with lots of long car trips. And so I think that's partly why we're seeing such high percentages of vehicle miles traveled. So I'm interested in the greenhouse gas emissions impact of our short trips, because I actually also think that we have a lot of opportunity in our region, and especially in Minneapolis, to replace shorter trips, 5 miles, 3 miles, 1 mile or less, with non-motorized trips or transit trips. So you could answer now or later, or we can talk later.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more about why we chose passenger miles traveled. But in short, it's really about modeling the technologies and understanding mode shift from moving to maybe a car where there's a single occupant to moving to something on public transit where there's 150 occupants. So that's the reason why we chose passenger miles traveled. I think the other thing that is definitely a follow-on analysis from the CYPT is to do something that's more GIS based. So the CYPT is citywide and we don't look at geography. But something like the comment you just made about short-term and short trips and long trips is absolutely spot on. And it's the type of thing that certainly when you're diving deeper into the analysis, you would want to look at. Absolutely.
Councilmember Fry might have another question on the same slide.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, these statistics apply whether or not the trip originated within the city, right?
So the way that we looked at it is we looked at trips originating in the city. We looked at trips originating out of the city, outside of the city and coming into the city, but we only look at the portion that happens within the city. So it could be that the person's coming from outside of the city coming in, and then we try to look at the portion of their trip that's within the city. So it'll be residents outside of the city as well. So this was our essential question, this 80 by 50 question. And when we were talking about building energy scenarios or building scenarios, infrastructure scenarios, to get to this 80 by 50 target, we came up with 3 different ways that we were going to look at the effects of the technologies. And they were all related to how aggressive Minneapolis would be cleaning its electricity mix. So we had the control where everything stayed the same, the electricity mix stayed the same as it was today. We had the Xcel Energy revised proposal extension, so that's basically taking what Xcel Energy has proposed and then extending it out to 2050. So you'll see that this is a much more aggressive mix in terms of wind adoption and then solar PV panels and adoption of rooftop PV panels. The third scenario was this climate champion scenario. Because we were doing the modeling without really knowing what the results were going to be, we wanted to have a very aggressive electricity mix that we put in there as well. So then when you look at just the baseline emissions, these 3 energy scenarios without applying any CYPT technologies, what you see at the top is this yellow dotted line, and that's the baseline for 2006, and that's when Minneapolis uses as its benchmark for the greenhouse gas inventory. You see that dark purple line, that's just the control. You see a kind of medium pink line, that's the Xcel Energy revised proposal extension, and then this bottom line, the climate champion, which is the most aggressive. So just in terms of numbers alone, when you're just looking at the electricity mixes, you get some reduction already. When you then layer on 40 of the CYPT technologies, so 40 of the 73 that were available in the tool, all of a sudden you see that the control drops down considerably, as does the Xcel Energy revised proposal extension and the climate champion. So looking at the actual numbers with this, even if you go with our slightly more conservative second scenario, you get an 82% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and this is the 80 by 50 achievement. So in terms of the technologies that were actually a part of this process, I clearly won't read through all of them, but the point of this slide is, that you can certainly read it after the presentation, but I wanted to point out a couple of different technologies on here, just to give you a flavor of what's in the tool. So there are some things in the tool that are more low-hanging fruit. It's the LED lighting, maybe in residential buildings. There are some that are a little bit more difficult, building out the EBRT, so the bus rapid transit network within the city. But what we tried to do was to take the city's existing plans, or Metro's existing plans, and then just push them to their limits. So we were trying to go for something that was ambitious but not unachievable. When we looked at the carbon impacts themselves, at which were the technologies that most affected carbon emissions and reductions of carbon emissions, things like the building envelope, so adding wall insulation, adding window glazing, things that are like not that exciting, but actually do a really good job in terms of improving the building stock and reducing emissions, were very high up there in terms of the results. The other thing that was very high up there in terms of results was electric cars. So it was sort of the residential building envelope, the non-residential building envelope, looking at building automation and improving building automation, meaning having automatic adjustment of lights, having automatic adjustment of blinds, being able to sense number of occupants in a room and adjust the temperature accordingly. Those are the types of things that we've been talking about with increased building automation. With the electric cars, we modeled about a 65% share of the total car fleet in Minneapolis as being electric cars. So that equates to about 200,000 additional e-cars, and they would probably replace the conventional cars that we have now. But that's a lot of new cars. We also looked at some of the freight transport results. So one of the highest that we saw was e-highway, and that's when you have a fully electric or a hybrid electric truck that connects and disconnects to an overhead catenary line that's usually running along a highway. So it's something that's being piloted in the US, actually, outside of the ports of Long Beach and LA, in Carson, California. We've got a test track there, seeing whether or not the impacts that we projected for this e-highway are as high as we think they might be.
Could I just ask, is this e-highway concept something that could work for BRT as well?
Yes. Yep. So then we also looked at job impacts. And we try to look at the local impacts of installing, maintaining, and operating the infrastructure. And when you look at that lens of the economic impacts of implementing the infrastructure, by far and away, the most impactful technologies are really around transportation, and they are the big ticket items like building out new metro lines. They also require, being able to do local hiring, particularly when it comes to building technologies. So that's sort of something that we kept in mind as we were doing the analysis. What types of skills would you need in order to build out some of these technologies?
So when you say metro new lines, are you meaning light rail lines or just bus lines or?
Light rail.
Light rail, okay.
Yep, so we're talking about light rail.
And what is the difference between light rail and tram?
So we have the light rail versus the streetcar.
Streetcar is the tram?
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Thank
sorry, difference in terminology, European and American. Yes. So then finally, we focused on a few high impact technologies. We wanted to look at what does a stepwise approach towards 80 by 50 really mean? And so set out some of the technologies that we thought were kind of consistent with the short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach. So one of the first things we looked at was energy efficiency and automation in buildings and having the public sector be a leader in that. The second thing we looked at was combined heat and power. So this is moving towards kind of a distributed energy or district energy system in probably specifically downtown Minneapolis, but this was geographically agnostic. The third was looking at reduction in car demand. So this is not a technology per se, but this was just a question of if you take people out of cars and put them onto public transit or other modes, what happens to emissions? And then the final thing was looking at electric cars. So I'll sort of run through these next few slides because I think they're probably better viewed after the presentation. But there's a couple of different energy efficiency and automation technologies that really rose to the fore in terms of being the most impactful. One was this building automation, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, really looking at taking choices, I guess, out of sort of individuals' hands and automating some of the processes within buildings around temperature, around lighting, and that sort of thing. And that had quite a large impact, even when just looking at non-residential buildings. It was about 8% reduction. 8% of the overall reductions were attributable to this. The next was looking more at retro-commissioning of buildings and at figuring out when you go into existing buildings and try to make them operate better, what are the results? And that was around 4% of the total reductions. And then we looked at the residential building envelope. And I think, this one was interesting for us because there was some of the highest reductions, 10% of overall reductions, would be achieved if you implemented this, the building envelope. So again, wall insulation and window glazing in 100% of the households. And between today and 2050, that would require about a $20,000 investment. And that's both capital expenditure and operating expenditure per household. Then we looked at combined heat and power. We looked at transferring some of the heating mix over to combined heat and power, making the generation of heating more efficient. And this was probably the top lever in terms of emissions reductions that we looked at specifically, with a 13% reduction in overall emissions. And then finally, we looked at reduction in car demand, what it would mean to shift 10% of the mode share to all other modes. And we got actually slightly lower emissions reductions than we expected. And we think this is largely because, first of all, this doesn't consider electric transport. But secondly, because there's already just so much car transport that even shifting just 10% didn't do as much as we considered. And then finally, we looked at electric cars. So again, this was around a 13% reduction in overall emissions just due to switching the car fleet to 65% of the car fleet being electric cars. So what does this mean in terms of what happens to Minneapolis in 2050? What does this mean in terms of building infrastructure? What we found, and these same numbers are duplicated on the next slide. Oh, sorry. What we found is that today you would have to increase the number of electric vehicles on the road by approximately 230,000 electric vehicles in order to reach this 80 by 50. At the same time, and this is based on studies that were done in other cities, you would have to build about 70,000 public charging stations. So around a 3-to-1 ratio in terms of charging stations to electric vehicles. And this might go down over time and certainly would go down as technology improves. But that's sort of a good leveling point for understanding what this kind of infrastructure would mean. You'd have to build out the bike share network, put more bikes in a bike share network, create more protected bike lanes, so move towards 200 miles of protected bike lanes from, I think it's 25 today. And then there would be a pretty significant reduction in both the electricity consumption and the heating consumption between today and 2050. So the CYPT didn't actually take into consideration some of the cost savings of reducing your energy consumption. But we've got a very basic estimate of what the annual savings would be equal to if you did this jump, this decrease in electricity consumption and heating consumption. And then finally, when you're talking about moving towards electric transportation or electrification of transportation, there's of course then this rebalancing, some additional electricity that would be needed. So one of the main things that we talked about this morning is what it means to the grid in terms of adding additional electricity to the grid from things like EV chargers.
So can I just ask, is there a certain assumption with the electric vehicles that now the coal has been phased out, or we're getting all this electricity from wind or solar, or is
so the assumption is that the coal has been phased out and that the electricity mix would be the electricity mix that we have under our revised scenario. So it would be, I think, 30% from wind, 40% from wind, 13% from solar, and then the remainder would be from nuclear, from natural gas, and there would be no coal.
Okay.
So it's a much cleaner electricity mix. And then finally, we had just a couple of facts related to these energy savings from buildings. So essentially when you're using these energy efficiency technologies, you all of a sudden have annual electricity savings and annual heating savings that equate to the current consumption in more than 160,000 homes, more than 185,000 homes. The final thing is just that, what does this mean in terms of moving people out of cars and into public transport? These technologies would require that people, of course, take other public transit options as well as move to more pedestrianism and cycling. And we projected that the mode share in this, as it relates to passenger miles traveled, would be shifted from 92% car to 57%. So this is a pretty big behavioral change related to people using more public transit.
So that's larger than the 10% you had in your slide earlier, right?
Yes. So this takes into consideration all of the technologies. It's not only this 10% reduction in car demand, it's also adding new metro lines, new BRT, et cetera. So it's the synergies of all of the technologies as opposed to the earlier estimate, which was just the individual impact of the technology or the policy. And that is it. Excellent.
So we've actually got another report after this if you're worried about taking off. So I'm curious, what technologies all did you look at? We've now got a company that's putting in, for example, they're going to be running water through the sewer system to create a district energy system where they're cooling or heating the water a certain degree. And then there's people interested in geothermal and those kinds of things. It looks like some of those weren't part of this,
Right.
or were they? Could you just talk a little bit more?
Yeah. So those were certainly complementary studies to what we were doing with the CYPT. We focused mainly on the buildings and transport technologies as opposed to the energy technologies. So the two energy technologies, I guess 3 energy technologies that we focused on were wind, PV power, and then CHP, so combined heat and power. But we didn't do the analysis of kind of district cooling and heating. On the buildings and transport side, they were, at least for the buildings, in 2 categories. One was sort of improving the building envelope, so things like wall insulation. The second was building automation. So starting to look at existing buildings and figuring out how you can optimize performance of those buildings, and then actually installing technologies that then would automate some of what was happening either in the room or networks of rooms. In terms of transportation, we tried to look at things that ranged from kind of cycling interventions, whether it was more protected bike lanes, more bike share, versus some of the larger passenger transport. So that would be like the new LRT or looking at expanding bus rapid transit, looking at switching the bus fleet over to either electric buses or to CNG buses. And those were some of the main things that we looked at.
Fantastic. I think we have some more questions. Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the presentation and all the data in it. My question for you is around looking at future technologies. I was wondering specifically around self-driving cars, to what level that's factored. I mean, for the price of, let's say, in 10 years, they're $50,000 each. Well, for the price of the Southwest Light Rail line, that's 36,000 cars that you could potentially have that are municipally or government owned as a public transit option that people could press a button and it could show up at your house within 1 minute and take anywhere you need to go and then go plug itself back into the solar panels. So I could see something like that really changing human behavior quite a bit and ultimately leading a lot of people to not need cars because they have that option available. How do you weigh that in? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty around these kind of future technologies, solar breakthrough, all that kind of stuff. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we get this question a lot about how do autonomous vehicles factor into CYPT. So for this particular analysis, we didn't take them into consideration other than to say that we knew that that was probably going to be a reality for 2050 and so would bear further investigation. In other cities that we've worked in, we've modeled autonomous vehicles in a slightly different way. So not to get too technical about it, but basically we've adjusted the model to look at increased utilization of cars and to understand what it means when you have essentially more car sharing or carpooling rather. So, just speaking more from a personal opinion, I think that moving towards car sharing, moving towards autonomous vehicles is something that will be part of this integrated multimodal system. And the CYPT can capture that, but for this particular project does not.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered if you looked at land use policies as part of this study. It seems not, and I think that would help give more hope to the possibility of transportation mode shifting being a more effective strategy. And not to discount the reality that you're acknowledging that a lot of people are driving long distances in our region, and realistically, maybe the technology piece is the more effective in the short term. But we're about to update our comprehensive plan. We have policies about directing growth to transit corridors, but frankly, our implementing policies, our zoning code could use some work in really reflecting that, if that's truly our policy goal. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity in Minneapolis to better align our land use policies within our region, our transportation policies like investments like the Southwest Corridor with higher density housing. So I don't know, I wondered if this looked at that. And then again, to your other point, maybe that's kind of a next step as we look at our comprehensive plan update.
Absolutely. So I guess two things. The first is that when Siemens was coming up with this tool, we tried to stick to what we knew. So in terms of land use, I mean, obviously we come up across land use all the time when we're doing projects, but that was not something we wanted to embed into the tool because that is certainly a kind of a local and policymaker decision. Just on the other side, from a completely personal point of view, and my background is as an urban designer and as being trained in economic development, land use is an integral piece of the puzzle. And in other CYPT projects we've done, we have integrated land use in some form or fashion by basically projecting out that people will use less square footage per person. So their homes will be smaller, their offices may be smaller. So we've looked at making the cities more dense in the future, and that has definitely given us more positive results in terms of emissions reductions.
Thank you. And I think there was, I guess you talked about the average early on, which was kind of a land use issue. So there was a little bit of that in there that we could think about. I just think this is fantastic. I'm curious, is the PowerPoint, is that the representation of all the information in the data? Or is there another report that people should get their hands on if they want to dig into it more deeply?
Yeah, so right now we have, and actually I could probably let Gail answer this question as well. But right now we have the PowerPoint is just the visualization of some of the data. Then we also have a set of data that was publicly available, data that we used for the project itself. So there's a data set.
And the city might have that on their website for people to access at some point?
Councilmember, the goal is to have a web page up by the end of the week and link it and let others know all about it as well. And we've got the university here who's really interested in taking the data and looking at it more closely. I think we have the state as part of their looking at 80 by 2050. Hopefully they'll evaluate it closely as well. So I think another really interesting topic is the work that Julie has been doing across the world and how the different cities have different levers, different policies, different interests, depends on what their electric mix is. If you're Seattle, it's hydro, what do you do? But those reports are starting to come out on the Siemens website, so we'll be able to look and see what's Mexico City doing, what's Copenhagen doing, what's San Francisco should be out shortly, so that we can learn more and compare to and try to learn from each other.
Wonderful. Very interesting stuff. I'm also curious to think about our climate action plan that we have, and should this information go into that, and are we supposed to look at making adjustments based on this? So that'll be something to look forward to and to look at. And also, it's obvious to me now that 80 is not high enough. And I always look at those graphs and I wonder, when are we going to actually admit that we can get to 100? And there was a nice slide that was showing the trajectory, and 100 wasn't very far off, because once you're at 86, I mean, what is that? So did you get a chance to figure out what year you think we could get to 100?
No, we didn't. Next time.
All right. And of course, we're always interested in what are the policy levers. We can try to encourage the city to buy electric cars to replace their fleet, or when we're doing our next building, we can try to make sure that envelope is really thick, and those kinds of things when we're building. But as you look at this and you think about what our policy recommendations, what difference could we make, and we'll also be thinking about it based on this. That could be significant. You were kind of hinting at a few with infrastructure for plug-in cars, and obviously we could see that our street lights and our intersections were costing a lot in terms of fossil fuels and that. So there's some of those things we can dig out of here too. I just really appreciate the information. This is pretty exciting. And maybe there can be a race. Do you think we have a chance of getting to 80% before Copenhagen and San Francisco and stuff?
Worth trying.
All right. Let's do it.
Thank you.
I'll just make a staff direction and we'll have that done. Right, Kim? Just kidding. All right. Well, I'm going to move to receive and file this. And also, people are going to meet across the hall and they'll talk about this further. We do have another issue that we're going to discuss here at the committee too. But on the motion to receive and file, is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. And lastly then, we want to get a report on our Minnesota Department of Health evaluation. We license our city's food, lodging, and pools, and we're kind of delegated with that authority from the state. And I know we've been working hard on that since our last time we were evaluated, and we're going to get a report today from Mr. Huff. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. Excuse me. I know you have been waiting excitedly for a report on a state audit, and that's what we have today. The Minneapolis Health Department had the first health inspectors in the state. I love this picture because it shows we used to actually go out to Wisconsin to inspect dairy herds for milk sold in Minneapolis. And we operate today under a state delegation. The state has authority over our state health codes, and they delegate that to Minneapolis to act on their behalf. We have delegation agreements with both the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And our delegation agreement, as with all agreements, it has rights and responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is that we fulfill the items of the delegation agreement and are then audited by the state to make sure that we're doing that. In 2010, our program was audited by the Minnesota Department of Health, and we did not do well in that audit. In fact, my second week in this role, I received a letter in February of 2011 that said this from the then current Director of Environmental Health for Department of Health. And we were subject to termination, not the best letter to receive. So we're going to talk about what happened and what we've done to fix it. And I am joined today by Ryan Crick, one of our supervisors of environmental health, Cindy Weckworth, another supervisor. We have Tom Hogan, the Director of Environmental Health at the State Department of Health. And a lot of health inspectors are here today as well. If you're on the health inspection staff, can you just raise your hand? So these are the folks that go out and inspect your restaurants every day and work for you. So I wanted them to come today to see a report of their amazing work over the last 4.5 years. Thank you, Ryan.
Congratulations, I think, are in order for all of you. It's a fantastic report. And is unacceptable the worst grade you could get in these reports?
Well, subject to termination would be
Termination?
Yes.
Then unacceptable?
Then subject to terminate, then unacceptable.
What's the top
4 different
grade?
levels. Acceptable.
Acceptable.
Top grade. Yes.
Wow.
All right.
Okay,
Good afternoon, Chair Gordon and committee members. As you can see, 5 of the 8 standards we did not fare well in. Under the first regulatory standard 1, we had issues with inconsistencies on city ordinances and policies where they were inconsistent with state statutes or rules. On our risk-based inspection program, we were not inspecting our facilities at the required frequency per the delegation agreement. Under Standard 4, we had issues in how we were documenting some of our inspections and also inconsistencies from one inspector to the next on where violations would be called. Some would call under one number, some would call under another number. In Standard 6, in that area, when they did the field component, they go out and they interview some of the establishments that we inspect. Our establishments did not score well on basic food knowledge and how to handle ill employees once they reported ill in their food establishments. Also under this area, we did have some policies that were, I would say, not obtainable or realistic, that weren't being followed on a day-to-day basis that needed to be rewritten. Standard 3 was the area where we needed the greatest improvement. 40% of our food establishments were not inspected on time. 73 of our lodging were behind on the frequency, and over 50% of our pools were not being inspected at the required frequency. In 2011, the employee survey summed it up very well. On average, over 50% of the responses were unfavorable on how the department was being run and what direction it was going in. In rebuilding the department, Dan joined us in 2010. At that time, he was our 5th director or interim director within a 5-year period. So there was a lot of changes. When he came in, he did eliminate the manager position at that time. We had 2 supervisor positions that were filled by Cindy Weckworth and myself. He also went and he interviewed all the employees just to have them be able to voice their concerns, any suggestions for improvements. One thing that came out of this that was very valuable was it wasn't an inspector issue. It was more systemic issues within the department and how it had been ran. We did a lot of work to restore trust amongst management and the employees and amongst co-workers. We had a very senior staff at that time, on average, well over 15 years experience with a few new staff, and it started to be more a separation between older and newer staff. So opening up those lines of communication and trust was very important. We also developed some performance measures that were shared with management and us, and were posted in our office monthly, and also discussed with inspectors on a monthly basis. We had a new office arrangement just to help foster that communication. Went into quad cubes and got a new office area. Environmental values were instituted by Dan, and then we use these values and our guiding principles daily in our decision making. Within a 2-year period, we had 18 separate code changes. We needed to make sure we were licensing everything we were required to by our delegation agreement. And once we had those established, we needed to make sure that we were inspecting at the right frequency. We developed variance procedures. Everyone likes in Minnesota our outdoor air establishments, the roll-up garage doors in our short summer months. Well, per the food code, they have to be minimum of screened in. So we went out and we had around a little over 100 establishments that we had to write variances for because they did not have that minimal screening. Also, we had a lot of establishments that were doing specialized processes, curing meats or sous vide cooking, that require added requirements and guidance to make sure that that food is produced safe. We're operating under a 1990 food code. There's been a lot of changes in how our operators run their establishments since that time. And if they're doing a procedure outside of that code, we need to write, either have a variance for that or have a HACCP plan approved for that process. Also in our Minneapolis, the majority of our establishments are independently owned, and they don't have corporate policies and procedures, so we need to work with them on those. This was one that we didn't have licensed. This is a picture of a Twins hot tub. We didn't look at that as a public pool. We were informed by the state, yes, this is a public pool. You must license and inspect it. So if you look down, I think it's the third to last. At least now we are sure that all pregnant women or children have been properly warned before they use the twins hot tub. One thing we developed was our field guide. So we had a standard operating procedures on how we do our inspections every day. This will cover us everything we do, from our complaints to our inspections to possibly even, when necessary, an emergency closure, and how we handle that within our department. This document now has grown to it's a 70-page document. We use marking instructions. There's over 700 different violations. Some are very, very fine line in what the difference between those violations are. And this is a place to go where we can have it written down. What are the differences and how we call that violation for the city of Minneapolis? We also implemented peer inspections, which we have once a month to go out and do a peer inspection with a coworker to make sure you're calling the violations consistently and under the right rule. We also did this last year with Minnesota Department of Health inspectors in the St. Paul area, and this year have expanded to Hennepin County. We have also added 3 senior health inspectors. They've been able to be our subject matter experts. They also do report review and ensure that we're being consistent. When we see inconsistencies on the peer inspections and reports, we have a monthly technical meeting where those are discussed, and we make a decision as a department on how we're going to handle that. This is an interesting chart, and if you look on the left-hand side, in 2002, we had 14 inspectors for over 3,300 establishments. The FDA recommended that time was 15. As you can see, as we moved to 2012, we had around a 25% increase in establishments that coincided with a little over a 20% decrease in the number of inspectors. On 13-14, with your support, we were able to add inspection staff to our division, and now to ensure that we can inspect our establishments at the required frequency. These are just showing us the performance measures that we post in our office and go over with inspectors each month. We have green, and inspected by the required time, and moves into yellow and red to make sure that we are hitting those. Also, the chart on the left shows the number of violations called per inspection to make sure we're being consistent in all our different districts in Minneapolis.
Thank you, Ryan. Now I'd like to introduce Tom Hogan, the Director of Environmental Health for the State Department.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Chairman Gordon and members of the committee, for the opportunity to come before you today. And I just want to recognize, my name's Tom Hogan. I'm the Environmental Health Division Director for the Minnesota Department of Health, of which the Food, Pools, and Lodging program is one of the program areas there at the Health Department at the state. I do want to recognize that compliance programs are not easy to operate. And not always, in my experience, not always easily managed within a public health kind of organization. But I do want to applaud the city staff, the program leaders, as well as yourself on the efforts that you have done to really turn this program around for the city. Great strides in improving the Food, Pools, and Lodging program here in Minneapolis. And as I've tried to communicate with our local partners and even leadership at the state, as we move towards working on issues around food, pools, and lodging in particular, as really a system approach within the state, it's very important to have great partnership at the local level in order to accomplish those. I think some of the things that you are able to accomplish at the local level are innovative and can help inform how the state moves forward. And I just want to thank you and again your staff for the work that they've done.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tom. And I want to just go over what those results are then. First of all, and I do want to point out that that first employee survey was before the health department. Now, in the health department with our commissioner, I want to make sure I call that out. As you can see, we have a re-energized team. We have some of the highest ratings on the employee engagement survey in the city. Very proud of that. And we also work really hard. As you can see, all of these standards that we had failed or really received substandard before are now at an A. Every one of our programs is now acceptable, which is the highest rating. And you can see our frequency there, where we went from 40% being uninspected on time to only 2% for food, and where we had